How to knit a mitered square. Hi everyone, my name is Norman. I run the blog nimbleneedles.com and today's video is all about knitting mitered squares. We'll start with the classic method right at the beginning of the video, and then I'll show you a couple of exciting alternative ways to knit them. And just as important, I'll show you how you can seam them together in a super invisible way or even knit them without seaming. So get your knitting needles and your yarn and I'll show you how to knit a mitered square. And of course, like this video right now or hit that subscribe button to support my work. And remember, you can comment anytime if you have a question. First of all, what is a mitered square? Basically, you are decreasing a normal rectangle down a center line. In every right side row, you decrease by 2 stitches, one in this direction and one in that direction. And this cuts out the center part here. And the result will be another simple square. So what's the big deal? Well, through that trick, you change the slant of the rows. See, they are suddenly at a 45 degrees angle. And you can create some very interesting color changes and mosaics with just knitting stripes, especially when you piece things together. Let's knit a mitered square together. Start by casting on an even number of stitches with a standard long tail cast on, leaving a long enough tail for seaming later on. You may consider casting on around 1 or 2 needle sizes bigger for a stretchier edge. For my practice piece here, I cast on 24 stitches with a DK cotton yarn and I'll be using 4mm needles. I'll link you the materials I am using in the description below. And then you can simply turn around and knit across one row. We'll be knitting this mitered square in garter stitch, so it's knit stitches all the way. And when you reach the exact center of your first row, we will place a stitch marker. In my case, this is after 12 stitches. And right here in the middle, I place a stitch marker. And I guess this is a good opportunity to check if you really cast on an even number. In my case, there are 12 stitches here and 12 stitches here. And then you can just continue knitting that row. And once you finish that row, turn around and knit across. And knit across until you are 2 stitches before the stitch marker. And here you need to knit 2 together, these 2 stitches. So knit them together. Let's do it one more time in slow motion. I'll link you my full knit 2 together tutorial up in here. And then slip the stitch marker. And here on the other side, you need to SSK these 2 stitches. Slip, slip, knit. So slip 1 stitch, slip the 2nd stitch, and then knit these together through the back loop. Let's do it one more time in slow motion. And then finish knitting across. And actually that's the whole repeat. You need to repeat these 2 rows over and over again. So at the end of the 2nd row, turn around, bring the yarn to the back and knit across. And row number 4 is another decrease row. So knit across until you are 2 stitches before the marker, 2 stitches before, and then knit these 2 stitches together again, slip the marker, and SSK these 2 stitches. Continue repeating these 2 rows, so always knit across 1 row and then decrease one row until you only have 2 stitches left. I recommend using another stitch marker in a different color to mark the right side. So whenever you see this marker here, you know, okay, this is a row where I need to decrease before and after the stitch marker. And if there isn't a marker, you just need to knit across. And if you continue decreasing with knit 2 together before and SSK after your stitch marker in every right side row, your mitered square will slowly take shape. You need to decrease until you have only 2 stitches left. So this is my last row. There are only 4 stitches left. So knit these 2 stitches together. Then you can remove the marker and SSK the remaining 2 stitches. And now that you only have 2 stitches left on your needles, you don't need to knit a return row. Instead, you can break your yarn, so cut it, leaving a nice tail. And then thread the tail on a tapestry needle and pull it through these last 2 stitches, like this. Pull tight. And you finished your first mitered square. In front of me are 3 little swatches, because if you Google how to knit a mitered square, you will actually find quite a lot of different patterns. Some will decrease with a knit 2 together before and after the marker, and this will be the resulting decrease line. Other tutorials will tell you to knit a SSK before the marker and knit 2 together after the marker, and this will be the decrease line. And here is our version where we knit 2 together before the marker and SSK after the marker. So where is the difference? Quite honestly, it really doesn't matter a lot. It's a purely cosmetic choice after all. I really like the way this decrease line looks, but if you prefer this decrease line, or you think that knitting and knit 2 together before and after the marker is easier for you, then pick whichever version you prefer. But this brings me to my first alternative. Instead of doing a decrease before and after the marker, you can also do a double decrease in the middle. In this case, you have to cast on an uneven number of stitches. Then you knit across the first row as normal, and then you need to decrease the center 3 stitches, these 3 stitches, 5 here and 5 here, with a centered double decrease, or a knit 2, 3 together centered. So I knit 5 stitches in this case because I cast on 13 stitches. And then I need to knit a centered double decrease, or knit 3 together centered. You need to slip 2 stitches knitwise, then knit 1 stitch, and now you need to pass over these 2 slipped stitches like this, and there is your centered double decrease. And if you decrease the center 3 stitches in every second row, your mitered square will look like this. So where is the difference really? This is the square we just finished before, and I hope you can see that the centered double decrease creates a much more pronounced decrease line. This can be a very beautiful design element, but it also can be a tiny bit disturbing. Also, you won't be able to place a stitch marker, so you either have to count stitches, or you need to learn to read your knitting. I'd be interested to know which version you like better, so please comment below and let me know. But here is the problem with mitered squares. If you are creating your own pattern, then it's sometimes a bit hard to judge how many stitches you need to cast on. But there is a super easy solution for this problem. Instead of decreasing in the middle, you can also start with just 1 stitch and increase along a central axis. Here's how to do that. Cast on one stitch, and then you need to knit a centered double increase into that stitch. Sounds scary? Not at all. Do a backward loop increase to the right, so like this. Essentially, you're just creating a twisted loop around your knitting needle. Then you knit one stitch, and then you do a normal backward loop increase. And this leaves you with 3 stitches here on your knitting needle. Then you turn around, maybe loosen up that stitch a bit. It can be a bit more difficult to enter. And knit across. Now you have 3 stitches. And here in the next round, you knit one stitch. Then you do another backward loop increase to the right. Knit one stitch and do a normal backward loop increase. And knit one stitch. And then you turn around, knit across, and these backward loop increases can be a bit fiddly to enter. And let's do it one last time here. In this case, I need to knit 2 stitches, then a backward loop increase to the right. Knit one stitch and a normal backward loop increase. And if you continue repeating these rows over and over again, you will create this mitered square. And the beauty of this method is you can stop when you believe your mitered square is big enough for your purposes. Just stop knitting right in the middle like this and then stretch it out a bit. And if you're satisfied, just bind off all stitches. There's one thing I would like to mention. There are many different ways to knit a centered double increase. I'll link you my full tutorial up in here in case you are interested. For a mitered square and garter stitch, I would try to stay clear of any method that uses a strand 1 or 2 rows below, as it will pucker your fabric, and that's why I used the backward loop increase like this here, because it doesn't make use of a strand 1 row below, which would always shorten your fabric a bit. And if you compare the centered double increase with my SSK Knit 2 Together version, I do believe this creates the most invisible version. So if that's what you're looking for, definitely try this. The first rows will be a bit fiddly, but after that it's quite simple. So now that we covered how to knit a mitered square, you might ask how you can knit a mitered square in 2 colors or even more. Well, because this is really where things get interesting. There are 2 approaches. First, you can change colors every 2 rows and simply carry the yarn along. So you cast on any number of stitches and then knit across 1 row. And then at the beginning of the 2nd row, you join in a new color. So you just knit across with a new color. And in the middle, you will have to decrease any way you like. Of course, this method also works with increases. But what you should do is, anyway, you should tie these 2 ends into a knot, just a simple knot, while the stitches are still on the needle, so it's easier to knit. And here right in the middle of your row, do your decrease. I am knitting a centered double decrease here, but if you prefer to decrease with SSK or Knit 2 Together before and after a stitch marker, that's just fine as well. The technique is the same. Then finish that row and oops, and then knit across the second row just the way we did before. And once you've finished knitting the third row, you can pick up the blue colored yarn again, or whatever your the color your yarn has, and then knit across, and make sure that you trap the second color here in between, and then knit across, and make sure that you don't pull too tight as you knit the first stitch, because this might shorten the leg here. After all, you're bridging 2 rows, so you don't want to pull too tight. And then continue according to the regular mitered square patterns. And once you finish knitting across the wrong side, you turn around again, and now you pick up the second color again, and again you need to make sure that you trap the other color here in between. See how it's trapped? And then you start knitting again. Don't pull too tight, just a tiny little bit after the second stitch, so you create a nice little float. And every 2 rows you change colors and cross the yarns, and if you continue knitting like this, you will create a mitered square in 2 colors. The big advantage of this method is that you only end up with altogether 4 tails, but of course the stripes can only be 2 rows high, at least if you want a neat and tidy edge. If you want to knit bigger stripes, then you need to join in a new ball after every stripe. So simply start knitting the row with a different color, and then decrease the way you prefer, and knit across the row. And again, I recommend tying these 2 ends here into a knot, so it's a bit, just a simple knot really, so it's a bit easier to knit those edge stitches, and then knit across. The only problem is, of course, that you end up with quite a lot of tails to weave in, 1 for each big stripe you knit. So I leave it up to you, and I'll link you my tutorial on how to weave in ends up in here, just in case, because there are many techniques in that tutorial that make it a bit easier. Just one important note: if you're knitting garter stitch, and most mitered squares are garter stitch, you need to change colors in a decrease row. If you don't, then your color transitions will look like this with these meandering lines. Before I show you how to join 2 mitered squares together, I want to show you 2 more variations. First of all, most tutorials show you how to knit a mitered square using garter stitch, and that is always a nice choice because it doesn't curl, and garter stitch has also a very unique gauge. So if you knit a mitered square following the same repeat in stockinette stitch, meaning you purl the return rows, you get a shape that looks more like, I don't know, a spare tip. But that doesn't mean you cannot use it for a project. Imagine you knit 8 of these, and then you join them together like this. And you do this twice, and so you have a front and a back, and then you get a sort of star-shaped pillow. Or what you can also do is you can embellish your garter stitch square with lace motifs. After all, lots of lace is based on garter stitch, and so it also has this square gauge. In this case, I created a simple mesh-like fabric by doing a simple yarn over knit 2 together combination in every right side row. But of course, you can go much more complicated. The basic idea really boils down to doing a double increase or decrease in the middle, and the rest is up to your creativity. Do, however, remember that different knitting stitch patterns have a different gauge. So this is 25 stitches in each case, but the lace is obviously a bit bigger, so be careful when you mix knitting stitch patterns. So, how do you seam mitered squares together? There are probably a million ways to do this, and it really depends a bit on your preferences. I'll show you my 3 favorite methods here. And here's one important tip. Before you even start knitting your mitered squares, I want you to pick a piece of paper and cut it into little squares. And then use some crayons or whatever and get creative and paint these little squares in the colors you want to knit. And then you can use these squares and check how you want to join your mitered squares together. Maybe you want to do it like this, or maybe like this, or maybe like this. There's so many different methods, and I guess that's the true beauty of this knitting technique. The way you need to join the mitered squares together depends a bit on the orientation. The easiest way to join them is edge to edge. So this is the cast on edge, this is the cast on edge, and this is the edge. And then you end up with 2 places, so here and here, where you can join using a simple garter stitch mattress stitch. I'll link you my full tutorial up in here, but let's seam a couple of stitches together. Thread either the cast on tail or a spare length of yarn on a blunt tapestry needle. If you're using a spare length of yarn, you need to pull the yarn through the first cast on stitch here, and in this case I only need to go through the very first stitch here. And then, can you see those ridges here? And there's always a top purl bump and a bottom purl bump, and you need to find the first little bottom purl bump here, this one here, and pull the yarn all the way through. And then you need to find the first top purl bump here, this one here, and pull the yarn through. And then you need to move onwards and find the next little bottom purl bump here, and the next top purl bump here. Always alternate between these 2 sides and go underneath it. Top purl bump and a bottom purl bump on the other side. Let's do one more stitch before I can show you the, well, preliminary result, I guess. Pull tight, not too tight, just a little bit so the fabric doesn't pucker, and this will join these 2 squares in a super invisible way. So I seamed all the way to the top. This is what it looks like now. Isn't it super invisible? This is the way it looks on the wrong side. And now you could pick up your next square and use the exact same technique and seam them together edge to edge. The next way to join 2 mitered squares together is cast on edge to cast on edge, and then you can just graft stitches to bridge the gap. So go into a purl bump here, into a top purl bump. You need to find the first top purl bump here at the bottom, and then you need to find, so here is the decrease line, and you need to find the first V here of a knit stitch on the top and go underneath that. Then you need to go into that purl bump again, pull the tail through, and then you need to find the next top purl bump and go through it. Let's bring it a bit closer to the camera. So you always, so here is the top purl bump, and underneath that top purl bump there are 2 legs here, and you need to go underneath those, and then you need to go out through the same top purl bump and go through that purl bump. And after every stitch, pull tight but not too tight, then find the next purl bump and go underneath. It's sometimes a bit harder to find. Go underneath the V here, go out through the same and find the next purl bump. And if you continue this repeat all the way to the end, your seam will look like this and almost invisible. You just end up with this one line here that is a bit double. This is the way it looks on the wrong side. And sometimes you want to join a cast on edge to an edge stitch. And in this case, the repeat is upper purl bump, upper chain stitch. So you need to find that first little upper purl bump here. And then you need to find the first upper chain stitch here. And pull the yarn through. And from here it's rinse and repeat. So upper purl bump and upper chain stitch of your cast on edge. Upper purl bump, sometimes they're a bit harder and more difficult to spot. Upper chain stitch. Upper purl bump. And upper chain stitch. It's important that you use the same, that the thread you do the seaming has the same color as your cast on edge. Let's do one more stitch and then we'll pull tight. There is the upper purl bump. Let's pull tight. So I finished seaming all the way to the top. This is what it looks like now. It's a really neat edge and it doesn't create a visible ridge here either. And I think this is super important. All the other techniques I showed you don't create a ridge on the wrong side either. And if you knit a blanket or so, I think this is very important. Now let me tidy up all those other tails and block things so you can see what it looks like in the end. So I wove in all tails and blocked this little swatch, and this is what it looks like now. This is the wrong side, this is the right side, and I'm mainly showing you this because I decreased all these mitered squares in a different way, and I've done the seams in a different way as well. And you might see that the overall look isn't all that uniform. And if you decide to knit a blanket or a pillowcase or whatever, then decide on one way to knit the mitered squares and on one way to join them to make the overall project look really uniform, because otherwise it might look a bit, well, chaotic, I guess. If you don't like to seam things, you can also pick up stitches instead. So after you finished your first square, you cast on half as many stitches as you did for your first square. Then you place a stitch marker. And now you need to pick up one stitch for each little rib here. So you go into the edge stitch and you will knit one stitch through that edge stitch like this. And then you go into the next edge stitch and you knit another stitch. And continue doing this through every stitch. What I personally do is I use a crochet hook because it's often much easier to do that. So you pick up one stitch through every ridge here. Like this. And once you picked up one stitch for each little ridge here, you simply turn your work around and knit across, and in the next round you start decreasing the way you did before. There's no difference at all. The only difference is that you pick up stitches or half the stitches. So a couple of rows later, this is what it looks like. Now, I think this is a very viable option for anyone who doesn't like to seam things all that much. And of course, you can also pick up stitches first and then cast on, or if you need to place one mitered square here in the middle, you can also pick up stitches from both edges. Just be careful here in the middle that you don't create any gaps. Personally, I have to say I never do it like this, because you end up with two tails either way, and you know, if I need to weave in things, well, then I can just seam it as well. Anyway, that's how to knit a mitered square. Please like this video if you enjoyed watching, comment with your feedback and your questions, and of course consider subscribing to my channel in case you don't want to miss any new videos. Happy knitting and enjoy the rest of your day.